Inga reo, inga mana, inga hoefa. Tena koto, tena koto, tena koto katoa. Ko Balmohan Shingade Taku Ingoa. My name is Balmohan Shingade. I'm a researcher, and it's my privilege to offer an introduction to the CARE White Paper Hindutva-linked organizations in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But first, please allow me to offer a karakia. Now, this is Narsi Mehta's 15th century poem in Old Gujarati, Vaishnava Janato Tene Kahiye, which was adopted by Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi into the roster of prayers routinely sung at the Sabarmati ashram. Vaishnava Janato Tene Kahiye Je Vaishnava Janato Tene Kahiye Je Pid Parai Jane Re Pid Parai Jane Re पर दुखे उपकार करे तोए पर दुखे उपकार करे तोए मन अभिमान न आने रे वैष्णव जन तो तेने कहिए. So I'll begin my presentation with an introduction to the white paper and setting the context for some of our discussion. So I'll ask for the slides, please. So Hindutva refers to the political ideology of Hindu nationalism, the core objective of which is to reconstruct India as a Hindu Rashtra, that is, a Hindu nation state. The idea of a Hindu nation state is diametrically opposed to, and indeed, it aims to undo the pluralist, secularist foundations of India as per its constitution of 1950. Next slide. The political ideology of Hindutva was first articulated by Vinayak Damodar Savarkar in his 1923 treatise Essentials of Hindutva. Hindutva remains a distinctly political project. The defining objective of the Hindutva movement, that is, a Hindu Rashtra constituting the territory of the Indian subcontinent, it's consolidated around a culturally hegemonic and racialized conceptualization of Hindu-ness. Since its inception in pre-independence India, the Hindutva project has aimed to create a cultural hegemony by attempting to unify the majority under a homogenized conception of the Hindus, while simultaneously marginalizing diverse minorities, including Muslims and Christians, who are framed as other to the Hindu nation state. Based on the principle of othering, the political ideology of Hindutva attempts to mobilize the majority against alleged injustices done by the other through cultural vigilantism, which is discursively constructed as safeguarding the interests of the historically victimized Hindus. Next slide. The Hindutva movement is organized as a network of paramilitary volunteers, political formations, religious institutions, and civil society groups, collectively referred to as the Sangh Parivar, or the family of the Sangh. That is, the family of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. The Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or RSS, translated as the National Volunteer Corps, is a paramilitary organization founded in 1925 on the principles of Hindu supremacy and the subordination of non-Hindus. The RSS provides ideological as well as weapons training, especially for youth through the Sangh Shiksha Varga camps. The pedagogical structure of the RSS, which includes youth training camps, is reproduced outside of India by the Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh, HSS, translated as Hindu Volunteer Corps. The HSS has a presence in approximately 135 countries, and members of the HSS are often former members of the Indian RSS prior to their migration. Next slide. Prominent RSS leaders, M.S. Golwalkar and S.S. Apte, along with Swami Chinmayananda of Chinmaya Mission, founded the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, VHP, in 1964. At its inaugural meeting, Apte elaborated on the formation of the VHP as follows. And here this is quoted in the slide. The world has been divided into Christian, Islam, and communist. All of them view Hindu society as very fine, rich food on which to feast and fatten themselves. It is necessary in this age of conflict to think of and organize the Hindu world to save it from the evils of all the three. End quote. So next slide. The quote, the organizing logic of the VHP is based on the principle of othering. It produces the idea of a Hindu society that is under threat by the evils of the other, and it figures Christians, Muslims, and communists as feeding on the Hindu society. By constructing Hindu society as victim, the Hindutva ideology propagated by the VHP motivates a sense of grievance in an effort to legitimize majoritarian violence. The VHP, the RSS, and the Sangh Parivar network of organizations have been condemned by the long-running inquiry commissioned by the Government of India for their contribution to counter-vigilantism and violence, particularly against Indian Muslims. And in 2018, the VHP and its youth wing, Bajrang Dal, were classified as a militant religious organization by the CIA in its World Factbook under the category of political pressure groups. With its roots in the political ideology of Hindutva, the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, asserts a Hindu nationalist policy. The BJP's policy agenda legitimizes marginalizing practices directed at diverse minorities. The BJP draws its support for the Hindutva movement from outside of India through its affiliated overseas Friends of BJP organizations. So, the Sangh Parivar is a network structure. Each organization remains autonomous, whilst also being materially interlinked with the others and committed to the political ideology of Hindutva. The strategic differentiation enables each organization to communicate across diverse registers of stakeholders and the flexibility to associate and disassociate from the broader movement. The Hindutva movement is propelled globally by the Sangh Parivar network structure, which is replicated outside of India. Since the 1990s, the ideological project of Hindutva has been mainstreamed globally through a wide range of communication channels, resulting in a propaganda infrastructure of digital platforms and traditional media, as well as cultural events and performances. There is a bidirectional flow of influence for the support of the Hindutva project, with the global Indian diaspora organizing financial, cultural, political, and volunteer support, while simultaneously being shaped by the organizing forces of Hindutva in India. Digital platforms form the core of the global Hindutva infrastructures, functioning complementarily with brick-and-mortar organizations and political structures. Salient in the global ascendance of Hindutva is the use of disinformation and mobilizing of hate-based content in digital ecosystems, networking Hindutva across spatially distributed nodes, building global narratives that enable and support the continued expansion of Hindutva. The global flow of Hindutva points to the need for a critical understanding of its brick-and-mortar infrastructures in the diaspora, such as news media platforms, religious organizations, and cultural groups. This white paper discusses key organizations in Aotearoa, New Zealand, linked with the Hindutva movement. The analysis is based on published texts, publicly available records, and report of the activities of the organizations. It provides details of their connections and material exchanges with the Hindutva organizations and individuals in India, their deployment of Hindutva concepts, cultural narratives, and symbolic references, and their strategies to spread the Hindutva ideology in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Furthermore, the paper identifies the communicative strategy of equivocation, which allows Hindutva groups in Aotearoa, New Zealand to lay claim to the Hindutva movement in India, while simultaneously obfuscating such links by appealing to multiculturalist liberal narratives, with the narratives of peaceful coexistence and Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is one family. Finally, the paper outlines how the Hindutva-linked organizations are legitimized in Aotearoa, New Zealand through an uncritical multiculturalism. It demonstrates how, in the context of multiculturalism, the platform that is provided to Hindutva-linked organizations is secured through the active participation of New Zealand politicians and public figures. Kua mutu aku kōrero I tēnei wā. With that, thank you very much. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I shall now hand over to Professor Mohan Datta to walk us a little bit further through the report.
Namihinui Balamohan, kia ora, and I will pick up from here to talk about the method that shapes this paper and get into our findings before handing over to Richa to discuss the implications of our findings. Just as a quick preview then, building upon Balamohan's argument, if we look at the construction of Sangh Parivar, which is the network of Sangh family, which forms that network infrastructure of Hindutva or Hindu nationalism, as he was referring to, there are a range of organizations that fall within this umbrella. For this presentation, we will specifically focus on these four key organizations, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh or the RSS, and its diaspora sister organizations, the HSS or Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh. We will focus on the political party that forms the political infrastructure of Hindutva, the Bharatiya Janata Party or the BJP. And then we will focus on the Vishwa Hindu Parishad or the VHP, which, as Balamohan articulated, has been in the past categorized as a religious militant organization. Attached to the VHP is Bajrang Dal, the youth religious militant organization. And here it is worth noting that VHP, Bajrang Dal, and RSS have been linked to violence within various communal contexts, including recent instances of communal violence that we have witnessed in India. Now, let's get into our method a little bit. So what this paper does is it maps the material infrastructure of Hindutva. What that means is that it actually looks at the ways in which Hindutva organizations connect with each other, draw upon resources, and the ways in which these resources then flow from one space to another across spaces and build that network that Balamohan was discussing earlier. So to do this, we first identified Hindutva organizations in Aotearoa by drawing upon the broader concept and looking at the nodal organizations. Then we mapped these Hindutva organizations and looked at the flows between these organizations here in the diaspora, as well as the interchanges between these organizations and Hindutva mother organizations, if you will, within India and in other parts of the diaspora. Through this process, then we mapped the discourses, the ways in which discourses flow across spaces and connect with each other. And this was shaped by a culture-centered analysis, which is framed by the culture-centered approach, the framework that we use at CARE that looks at how culture is mobilized to shape and uphold particular structures and the ways in which then that configures how human agency is configured, and what it means in terms of the kinds of discursive moves that are articulated, the ways in which that connects to material calls, the ways in which that connects to material expressions, and therefore really suggesting that what we see in discourse connects to what we see in materiality. In other words, what we might see within digital infrastructures, what we might see in terms of pedagogy in what is being taught by Hindutva organizations, those actually have material manifestations. So, a quick preview of these three key organizations. I don't want to delve into the details as Balamohan has already done it. So, the point I want to make is that VHP has been linked with communal violence on multiple instances. The RSS is shaped by an infrastructure that is directly connected to the fascist ideology, particularly in terms of the organizing of a nation around the concept of monolithic culture. And if you look at our early RSS texts, you see this linkage spelled out quite clearly. And BJP then, which forms the political infrastructure of Hindutva. And the one point I want to make then is that if you look at the roots of the BJP in the Jana Sangh, the Jana Sangh was created with the aim to include the protection of India's Hindu cultural identity. So BJP as a political formation organized around the notion of politicization of Hinduism to construct the nation based upon a monolithic Hindu cultural identity, and countering what it perceived to be the appeasement of Muslim people and the country of Pakistan by the ruling Congress party and then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. Now, this is a key point because it shapes ongoing policy infrastructure of Hindutva, particularly in terms of the contemporary strategies of BJP in the context of the disenfranchisement of Muslim citizens, in the context of response to Kashmir, in the context of various laws around, for instance, the Uniform Civil Code. Now, BJP is interlinked with a number of Hindutva organizations, but the point here I want to highlight is that the RSS pracharaks or volunteers of RSS are key architects in terms of the infrastructure of BJP. In the early years of the Jana Sangh, they served as the full-time workers to get the new party off the ground, and this continues to be sort of the material infrastructure of political Hindutva, if you will. The current Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, was a pracharak of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or the RSS. Now, let's turn to the mapping of the Hindutva organizations in Aotearoa. We begin our analysis by looking at the Hindu Council of New Zealand. The Hindu Council of New Zealand was formed in mid-1990s and subsequently registered as a charity. Now, according to its constitution, and here I quote, the name of the organization shall be the Hindu Council of New Zealand Incorporated, and then in parentheses, in ethnic language, Vishwa Hindu Parishad of New Zealand Incorporated, end quote. Now, on the website of India's Vishwa Hindu Parishad at the time of gathering this data, NZ was listed under New Zealand main Hindu organizations under the broader section Hindus Abroad. Now, one of the points that we want to note here is that official registration does not equal formation, and there are conflicting statements in terms of our analysis of the online resources regarding the date of establishment. For instance, the Encyclopedia of New Zealand cited on page 3 says mid 1990s. The VHP site alludes to 2005. Company registration was 2006, and charity status was given in 2007. The HCNZ website listed on its Facebook page and on numerous news stories was inaccessible at the time of conducting this research. For much of our analysis, we draw upon the Constitution of the Hindu Council of New Zealand, incorporated in 2010. We also note here that on that VHP website, referring to the VHP India website, there are other organizations that are also listed, including the Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh, or the HSS, that we discussed earlier, mapped onto the RSS, BAPS Swaminarayan, International Society for Krishna Consciousness, or ISKCON, Chinmaya Mission, Hindu Youth New Zealand, and New Zealand Hindu Students Forum. Now, one of the strategies that we see in terms of the ways in which HCNZ presents itself and its linkages to the VHP is the strategy of equivocation, where the strategy both articulates identitarian connection to VHP and simultaneously obfuscates such identitarian connections by appealing to religious tolerance, universal connection, and coexistence. So even as the HCNZ makes various forms of rhetorical claims and linkages to the VHP, including, as we will see, facilitating the movement of people and resources between the diaspora and India, they also deploy what communication scholars talk about as a strategic ambiguity to claim separation from the VHP. As a former president of HCNZ, Vinod Kumar notes, and here I quote, "We are morally linked to the VHP, comma, but not physically linked," end quote. So what are the kinds of material flows we see here? We see that there are exchanges of people between HCNZ and Hindutva organizations in India and the global infrastructure of Hindutva. And that connects also with flow of resources, including communicative materials, pedagogic materials, concepts, as well as business opportunities, as we will see. Swami Vijnananand, and now Swami Vijnananand is a key figure, as we will see, in terms of this architecture here in Aotearoa. The Joint Secretary General of the VHP and the founder and chair of the World Hindu Foundation, was a guest at the first New Zealand National Hindu Conference in Auckland in 2007. He was also hosted by the HCNZ in 2017 for an open discussion section in Porirua City. This is presented in an image in the paper itself. In a 2019 news story published by New Zealand Stuff, Swami Vijnananand was described as, quote, brains behind the World Hindu Economic Forum, end quote, WHEF. One of the points I want to note is the name Vijnananand is spelled differently in different places, including in media reports here. Sometimes is referred to as Vijnananda, sometimes is referred to as Vijnanand, sometimes is referred to as Vijnananand with GHYA. Now, the WHEF provides a platform for prominent Hindutva ideologues. And here we want to note that the 2019 forum was attended in terms of the representation from Aotearoa by Hardik Desai, Raj Tyagi, Vinod Kumar, and Guna Magason, representing, quote, Team New Zealand, end quote. Magason has been the General Secretary of HCNZ, the current president, and Kumar, the former president of HCNZ and chair of Hindu Heritage Trust. Now, the delegation at the WHEF in 2012 included Mr. Vinod Kumar, Managing Director of Magson's Hardware Limited, Dr. Guna Magesan, Director of Kiwi Bharat Limited, and this is from a news story that covers this, and General Secretary of Hindu Council of New Zealand at that point, Mr. Kuldeep Sharma, Director of Dairy Care New Zealand, and the politician at that point with New Zealand First, Mr. Mahesh Bindra. Now, or earlier with New Zealand First, Mr. Mahesh Bindra. Now, Kumar and Magesan have been involved with the WHF since its inception, according to the story. In 2005, the RSS publication, what one might call the RSS mouthpiece or the propaganda infrastructure, the organizer, named Magesan as the CEO of the WHEF. In 2019, Stuff reported that Magesan was invited to sit on the governing council of the WHEF, the second New Zealander after Vinod Kumar. Now, an HCNZ 2012 press release states, and I quote, "A number of Hindu business leaders from around the world are interested in investing in New Zealand in general and with Maori businesses in particular, and we have invited them to participate in the New Zealand Hindu Business Conference next year," end quote. This demonstrates the economic angle and the economic premise that is captured here. And the WHEF was mobilized around this idea that forming businesses around the Hindu concepts creates an economic opportunity. So these are some of the screenshots that we wanted to share with you here. So this is Swami Vigyananand, with the Hindu Council of New Zealand Wellington chapter that we discussed earlier. So critical to note here is the discursive infrastructure and the ways in which this discursive infrastructure connects organizations here to Hindutva in India. So worth noting here is the bidirectional flow of Hindutva ideologues, both in people and resources, but also the flow of concepts and ideas. So writing for the organizer, the mouthpiece of RSS, in an article titled, I quote, "Exploring Brand NRI," end quote, Magesan notes in a section labeled, I quote, "Can we realize make in India without making India a man-making nation, question mark," end quote. And I will read out from this quote for you with some of the critical parts that have been bolded here. "With the support of Sangh Parivar organizations and other Hindu organizations, children born and brought up in overseas countries spend reasonable time in understanding our traditions, cultural heritage, and our Hindu way of life. Public educational programs such as conferences, seminars, and workshops are organized to benefit young Indians. Similarly, such programs need to be organized in India. Sangh-inspired organizations need form alliances with other like-minded Hindu organizations to develop a strong, vibrant, and assertive Hindu society." Note the term assertive Hindu society. This is a key term because it is organized around the necessity for Hindus to assert ourselves. Param Pujaniya Guruji, this is referring to one of the Hindutva architects, Goldwalker, had correctly said, again, I quote, "Our brethren abroad will have to bring about a total transformation in the thoughts and lifestyles if they have to lead a happier, richer, and more honored life abroad, and also make the image of India shine brighter in those countries," end quote. Once that happens outside India, it will be followed in India. So you note here the call to Indians in the diaspora to become part of this movement in shaping and in contributing to Hindutva abroad, in contributing to the image of India abroad, how the image of India abroad is intertwined with the Hindutva, and then in contributing to the Hindutva infrastructure in India and to shaping, if you will, the politics of India. So one can read this as an invitation to shaping the material infrastructure in India. Let's now move on to the next organization that we have analyzed, which is the Hindu Swayam Sevak Sangh, HSS. Now, the network structure of RSS is exported and reproduced outside India through HSS organizations globally, spread globally. As Balamohan pointed out, there are HSS organizations across 135 countries at the point of writing this report, including in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Now, these organizations, they make up the global reach of the HSS, and in propagating HSS, the Hindutva idea globally. And members of the HSS can be or have been former members of the RSS in India prior to their emigration. So there is a pattern of flow that is often documented. Now, the HSS New Zealand was established in 1996. Currently, there are 9 shakhas or chapters. This language directly comes from the organizational structure of the RSS, naming these chapters as shakhas. There are 9 shakhas of HSS NZ in Aotearoa, and it has an extensive list of objectives that replicate the objectives of the RSS, including the section on the rules of the society. And we will just pick up one part of it. For instance, in the quote here, to take step desirable with a view to establish a disciplined society of Hindus. Note here, a disciplined society of Hindus, the notion of disciplining, generally by eradicating vociferous tendencies. So, creating a monolithic Hindu identity, if you will, by eradicating vociferous tendencies. Now, locate this within the context of Hinduism being a plural, diverse, multifaceted a religion with multiple interpretive communities, and contrast that with this notion of creating a disciplined society of Hindus, generally by eradicating vociferous tendencies arising from diversity of sects, faiths, caste, creed, language, and other differences that appear among them, end quote. So this notion of a monolithic Hindu identity, in many ways, one might argue, exist directly in contradiction with the notion of Hinduism being a broad umbrella for diverse sects, practices, and diverse ways of knowing. So the HSS structure that we see reproduces the organizational structure of the RSS in terms of its constitution and membership, including how the office bearers are structured. And this forms the organizational structure of RSS, both in India and in these global networks. And, one of the arguments made by scholars studying the infrastructure of RSS is that it is this structure that helps RSS organize its their propaganda infrastructure, recruiting new members and growing the organization. So the organization has a president, a secretary, a joint secretary, a treasurer, public relations officer that are named Sangchalak, a Karyavaha, a Sahakaryavaha, a Nidhi Pramukh, and a Sampark Pramukh. And each of these roles differ, but they are really critical in terms of carrying out the infrastructure of the organization. The foundational, so if we look at the HSS pedagogy, one of the things that becomes really important is the ways in which the education of the youth becomes an organizing feature of HSS. And this connects to how RSS constructs the notion of pedagogy. So foundational figures of Hindutva ideology, such as B.S. Munji and V.D. Savarkar, took inspiration from fascist youth movements of 20th century Europe. In his diary during a visit to Italy, Munji expressed his thoughts on Opera Nazionale Balilla, the foremost Italian fascist youth organization. And here I quote from Munji: "The Balilla institutions and the conception of the whole organization have appealed to me most. Mussolini saw the essential weakness of his country and conceived the idea of the Balilla organization. Nothing better could have been conceived for the military organization of Italy. The idea of fascism vividly brings out the conception of unity amongst people. India, and particularly Hindu India, needs some such institution for the military regeneration of the Hindus, end quote. This idea of forming an infrastructure for pedagogy based upon structured, disciplined education then plays out in terms of how RSS constructs its pedagogy and then how it is exported across the diaspora. Now, when we look at the HSS pedagogy then and connect it to HSS NZ activities, we see how these mirror each other. And here I quote from one of the reports that is available on the digital platform of HSS NZ. This is from an attendee's testimonial of 2019 HSS event. And I quote here, the HSS NZ's Sangh Shiksha Varg Camp, this is what Balamohan was referring to, held in Auckland, April 2019, was aimed at families and young people and sought to train them in the structural framework of the RSS. So you see the link to RSS being articulated here. The pedagogy of the camp was structured on the RSS pedagogy, constituted into Sharirik and Bodhik activities, so physical and intellectual activities. Like its counterparts in the HSS globally, the camp incorporated marching and martial training to effectively use a lathi, a long, heavy bamboo stick used as a baton, and discussions related to Hindu dharma, way of living, and what we can do to protect it. So the part that I'm quoting here from there is discussions and the ways in which these discussions are framed relating to Hindu dharma, way of living, and what we can do to protect it. That comes directly from the testimonial. Now, the paper includes images then from similar such events. In presenting these images, we have worked to ensure, even though these are images on public spaces, to not really focus on individuals, because our broader emphasis is on the ideology and its workings. So these are some examples of events. So this is teaching your child to be a team player. Come join us every day. So the language is about working together shaped within then the infrastructure of the RSS organization, taking them to weekly shakha. Here's another one with HSS, where it's reference to a center in Hamilton where children learn yoga, shlokas, and other Hindu rituals. And again, connecting it to the notion of the shakha, tied to that infrastructure of organizing. Now, one of the fundamental features of this organizing is the basis of the pedagogy in a sense of anxiety about Western influence. And this sense of anxiety then is connected to the notion of assertion that we have seen earlier. In other work that has been presented by CARE, we have discussed the ways in which the construct of Hinduphobia or fear of the Hindu is manufactured by Hindutva organizations in order to mobilize Hindutva in the diaspora. And now map that onto the sense of anxiety that is articulated here. So the fear and the anxiety then become the basis for articulating this need for assertion. So this is the RSS is the organizer explaining this anxiety. Now this is written in a US context, and I quote, this is an article in 1996. The American Hindu is perpetually concerned that his children are brought up in the Hindu tradition, that he gets acquainted with the Hindu gods and goddesses. Some of the parents are highly exercised over their children being tainted by the Western culture. So this notion of tainting by Western influence. Some, they are now repenting at leisure that in their blind pursuit of wealth, they have abandoned their children to absorb the Western culture. others have awakened to the danger. So this notion that the Western influence is a danger or a threat, and one needs to wake up to it and assert through the teaching of the religion. Now, something else that we noticed across these HSS infrastructures is the direct celebration, if you will, of Hindutva ideologues. So this is one image that is from March 2018, where you see that these various Hindutva ideologues are being celebrated. Here you have V.D. Savarkar, K.B. Hegrewar, Lakshmibai Kelkar, and M.S. Golwalkar, that have been garlanded, and there are flowers placed around them. Now, this is another post that is venerating Hindutva ideologue, and often HSS-NZ has referred to Golwalkar, I quote, as one of the greatest social reformer of post-independent India, end quote. Again, quote, a seer and visionary, end quote, and as a, quote, Rashtra Rishi, end quote, a saint of the Rashtra. Similarly, the HSS-NZ has referred to Savarkar as, quote, a great man, end quote, great freedom fighter, end quote, the epitome of selflessness, patriotism, and courage, end quote, as well as, quote, righteous legend, end quote. Golwalkar and Savarkar are foundational figures of the Hindutva ideology. Indeed, Hindutva as a political ideology was codified by Savarkar in his 1923 pamphlet, Hindutva, Who is a Hindu? It is critical to note that Golwalkar and Savarkar were both inspired by fascist ideologies in Europe. In his 1939 book, Golwalkar wrote, I quote, German race pride has now become the topic of the day. To keep up the purity of the race and its culture, Germany shocked the world by purging the country of the Semitic races, the Jews. Then we continue, a good lesson for us in Hindustan to learn and profit by, end quote. In an address to RSS members the year before, Golwalkar asserted, I quote, if we Hindus grow stronger in time, Muslim friends, again, will have to play the part of German Jews, end quote. The fundamental value of racial inequality that underpinned the European fascist movements was advocated by Savarkar in the context of India. The concept of a Hindu race or a jati, which is so vital to Hindutva, formed the basis of Hindutva as a supremacist ideology. When asked by an American war correspondent in 1944, I quote, how do you plan to treat Mohammedans, referring to Muslims, end quote, Savarkar replied, I quote, as a minority in the position of your Negroes, end quote. The cult of personality developed around the key archetypes of Hindutva, whose political organizing is built upon fascist and Islamophobic elements, have vital implications for how we look at Hindutva-related organizations across the diaspora. We will end this presentation with the BJP, the Overseas Friends of BJP. BJP, as we articulated earlier, is the political arm of Hindutva. So with its roots in the political ideology of Hindutva, the BJP asserts a Hindu nationalist policy infrastructure that seeks to organize India as a Hindu nation. So it gives effect, if you will, to this far-right ideology by creating policy formations around the notion of the Hindu Rashtra. The BJP's policy agenda legitimizes marginalizing practices directed at diverse minorities, particularly against Indian Muslims and Christians, and endorses communal violence and militant action. Here it is also worth noting that this process both disenfranchises India's Dalit, oppressed caste and Adivasi indigenous communities, while at the same time seeking to co-opt and incorporate them into the broader Hindutva umbrella. So this process of erasure, marginalization works alongside co-optation. The Overseas Friends of the Bharatiya Janata Party New Zealand was established in 2014 in the lead up to the Indian general election. In the United States, the Overseas Friend of BJP USA registered itself as a foreign agent. This is a critical point. In the backdrop of Prime Minister Modi's decision to endorse President Trump, and after his party's willingness to mobilize sections of the Indian American community to advance controversial policy causes, here particularly worth noting are the Modi Trump mega events that were held by OFBJP and allied Hindutva organizations in the US that demonstrated the convergence, if you will, between Hindutva and white supremacist ideologies, and often connected with their mutual mistrust of and marginalizing practices toward Muslims. Islamophobia is a key element in that connecting infrastructure. Now, on its public facing, and this is something that is really critical in our paper, on its public facing Facebook and Twitter platforms, we observe that the Overseas Friends of BJP New Zealand frequently reposts and shares content from the BJP, VHP, RSS, and HSNZ. So, demonstrating the linkage both with organized Hindutva organizations in India and then with Hindutva organizations within that infrastructure here in Aotearoa. So let's just look at some of these examples. So this is an image from an RSS camp. This is what RSS camps look like. And you look at the imagery here in terms of the outfit and then situate that within the context of what we discussed about the pedagogy. And this is the backdrop of the Overseas Friends of BJP New Zealand site. Similarly, you see here postings that directly draw from across contexts in India. We see here postings on the Overseas Friends of BJP New Zealand site that directly draw from VHP. Similarly, that directly draw from RSS. This is Mohan Bhagwat. That also directly then connect with organizations like HSS in Aotearoa. So this demonstrates the interlinkages. I will now turn over to Richa to discuss the implications, recommendations, and limitations. Richa.
Kia ora, everyone. Lovely to be here and present this work. Yeah, I'll go over some of the implications and recommendations, and I'll wrap up with a little conclusion. So after undertaking this work to really delve deep into Hindutva organizations in Aotearoa, we started to think, like, what's next? What is there to learn from this map that we've developed? So we suggest the relevance of critically interrogating the charitable status granted to organizations in Aotearoa, New Zealand, with links to the Hindutva ideology. I believe the HSS and the Hindu Council of New Zealand are both registered charities in this country, and often get support through the government, through the Charities Commission, etc., through that status. Also worth critically interrogating the ways that government agencies attend forums hosted by the Hindutva-linked organizations. We see particularly the Human Rights Commission, as well as many politicians attending events organized by these the organizations we have mentioned today. And this is in many ways legitimizing this ideology and these organizations. It's worth critically interrogating and kind of really delving into where these Hindutva-linked organizations are receiving funding. We can see some of their financial returns through the Charities Commission, but it's often an incomplete picture, and it's not very clear where these funds are coming from. And also the ways that government agencies issue invitations to Hindutva-linked organizations to participate in forums. This is something we've also seen from the Human Rights Commission and many other government ministries. Finally, drawing on the concept that voice infrastructures serve as the basis for building social cohesion, we recommend that in order to give effect to the spirit of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into the Christchurch attack, it'll require centering the voices of Indian Muslims and diverse Indian minority communities who are affected by Hindutva. Particularly during crises, as evident in Leicester, it is critically important to listen to Muslim voices in mainstream media, policy analyses, and state response. In terms of limitations and future directions for this work, in demonstrating the presence of Hindutva-linked organizations in Aotearoa, New Zealand, this paper is limited to the analysis of secondary sources, published texts, publicly available records, and reports of activities. We recommend the future research examine the practices of Hindutva-linked organizations in Aotearoa, although access will pose a key challenge, particularly while maintaining the commitment to informed consent. Alongside this, it's equally important for future research to have in-depth interviews with gender diverse, religious, and oppressed caste minorities in order to develop strategies that counter the effects of Hindutva ideology in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And some questions that we had from this research is, what are the consequences for organizing, funding, and promoting visits of Hindutva ideologues from India? What are the consequences for New Zealand organizations, institutions, and platforms that host public speeches delivered by Hindutva ideologues from India? And what are the consequences for the propagation of Hindu ideology by New Zealanders attending and representing Aotearoa, New Zealand at Hindutva-linked international conferences? And what are the consequences for training New Zealand youth in pedagogy linked to Hindutva organizations in India? So it's a lot to unpack, but I think what's really important, especially as we start to conclude this presentation, is to bring it back to the kind of the lived realities that Hindutva is causing in India. I mean, we can talk about a political ideology in the abstract, and we often, as academics, we tend to really focus in on these kind of ideas. But the reality is, in India right now, violence against minorities and violence against minorities, particularly Muslims, Christians, has been ever increasing as we speak. The state of Manipur is seeing some major tensions between it's a complex situation between Hindu and Christian groups, and through this we've seen loss of life, loss of home, as well as the sexual abuse and torture of women. So to really bring all this back to reality, what's happening on the ground, that's it is a site of violence, it's a site of danger, and it's something that we really need to interrogate, and really interrogate our relationship with Hindutva as a country. Yeah, I think that's all from me. I think we're passing back to, is it Mohan and Balamohan? Are we all coming up?
Wanted to thank you so much for offering those implications as well as those sets of questions. I just wanted to highlight one of the elements that you pointed out. So the question we are asking is not the propagation of Hindu ideology, but what are the consequences for the propagation of the Hindutva ideology by New Zealanders attending and representing Aotearoa, New Zealand at Hindutva-linked international conferences? And that directly ties in with this argument, and we will hear from Hindus for human rights today, with the argument that Hindutva is not only a threat to India's minority communities, Muslims and Christians, and in the diaspora as well as Sikhs, but also it's a threat to Hindus in the diaspora. So I just wanted to place that in there. Balamohan, if you wanted to add something, and then we can perhaps move on to our respondents that we have today with us.
It's really exciting to be able to introduce our respondents. So perhaps I can say a little bit about who we have today. We've got representing Hindus for Human Rights, Dr. Sapna Samant. We've got representing Aotearoa Alliance of Progressive Indians, Dr. Joseph Thomas. And we've got an expert correspondent here, Byron Clark, who's an author and a recently published author of Fear. So really exciting to be able to invite you all to this corridor and to hear your reflections on what has been discussed so far. So I'll open the
So,
floor to Dr. Sapna first, if you'd like to say a few words.
sure, Kira, thank you for having me here. Thank you for your work. This is an amazing piece of work, such detailed evidence, which cannot be argued against, because even though we have seen the limitations, but we all do that, for academic work, we also always have those limitations. So it's not really anything to worry about. I am just really, really pleased with this piece of work, and I'm very happy to respond to what you're saying. This first of all, let me just reiterate that I am a Hindu, and I am part of a global organization called Hindus for Human Rights. We are it's pretty obvious from the name, Hindus for Human Rights, but we try and hold the essence of what Hinduism is, which is, it's a pluralistic, inclusive religion, way of life that can be argued as well, but that is an argument for across all cultures and religions, is what you do is deeply connected to what your religious practice is. So yes, we are a pluralistic and inclusive religion, and that is being eroded. That is being eroded by Hindutva. And for me, I've not only been an eyewitness to this growing up in India, but when I moved to Aotearoa and I saw Hindutva organizations over here so blatantly talking about Hinduism as if their own framework, it really shocked me. It made me sad, and it made me very angry. Also deeply saddened and a little bit irritated at times that there are politicians who still continue to interact with Hindutva ideologues in Aotearoa. But I just wanted to, coming back to what Hinduism is and how the Hindutva ideology is actually really, really harmful to the majority of Hindus. So when Hindutva ideologues talk about making India a Hindu Rashtra, it is a monocultural, monolithic singularity that erases every single variance and difference in how Hindus are. We are every sort of a few kilometers from each other, like you have changing accents in England. We have different practices. There's overlaps and there's intersections, but we all have different practices. We have different ways of doing things. If you are born a Hindu and you're an atheist, you're still Hindu, because atheism is considered to be part of Hinduism. It's okay to be an atheist. And what we are seeing in Hindutva is Brahmanism. It's like white supremacy. It's a form of supremacy. So if you know the caste system of India, where the Brahmins are right at the top, which they have allocated themselves that top space, everything else is to be obliterated and everything else is to be erased. And that hurts me very deeply at a personal level, and makes me want to be active at the political and community level, because it is like the way I practice, the way I pray, practice my religion, the way I pray, the way I'm teaching my child, what we do at home, all of these things are considered to be non-Hindu. And who defines that? Who defines that this is non-Hindu? If we are, this whole idea about vegetarianism being so the core of Hindutva ideology or Hinduism, their framework of their idea of Hinduism, we are not vegetarian. We are fish eating, traditional fish eating folk from the west coast of India. We got our food, our kai, from the Arabian Sea. So are you saying that it's because we did that we are no longer Hindu? I mean, who decides that? Who decides which gods we pray to with, millions of gods that we have? And all of this is being erased and eroded by Hindutva ideology and the sort of, way it's a threat. It's a threat. Who decides how we perform the last rites of our people? I'll give you an example of my father. He did not want any last rites, right? So we didn't do any last rites. When he died, I was the one that lit the funeral pyre. Now, if you follow the strict Brahmin way of things, then as a daughter, I'm not even supposed to do that. But nobody cares in our family. That's because for us, our Hinduism is not what the Hinduism of Hindutva is. There was no fourth day ceremony. There was no 13th day ceremony. We don't have, rituals. For none of my ancestors, for that matter. The only time we do this for my ancestors is when we go to our ancestral village and go to our the temple, ancestral deity temple, and the village deity temple, and that is enough for us. So all the rituals, all the teachings of Hindutva are actually questioning at the very core of I mean, and I'm using my personal example, questions the very core of who I am and what my family has been for generations before my great grandfather even migrated to Mumbai from the Konkan. So this before I even talk about the minorities and what is happening, and it's really, really awful that this is happening, and we should be standing up against this. We should be pointing out how the Muslims are being considered as outsiders, how Christians are being considered as outsiders, because these religions came to India from the outside. But I mean, the story is that one of Jesus's apostles came to India, when they were spreading Jesus's word. So and Muslim traders, we've been trading with Muslim traders forever. So it's not these are not outside religions. Yeah, so I just sort of, for me, and this is what Hindus for Human Rights stands against, is that we acknowledge all the differences and all the wonderful things that are there in Hinduism, which is what makes us tolerant and accepting of each other, of different religions. The LGBTQI people within our religion, we have the third gender. There is no question about it. We have the caste. Now, I do have to sort of hark back to that. The caste system needs to be dismantled. Again, no question about that. It's a very, very problematic issue, and we need to dismantle that. And then again, within my family, we do not believe in it, and so we have, all kinds of different backgrounds, people of different backgrounds who are married into my family, or my family has married into. So it's are you questioning that way of life for us, that this is not Hinduism, that we are not Hindus? That is what Hindus for Human Rights stands against, is that you can't question us about what our practice is, about what we do, what foods we eat, what gods we pray to, how we pray to, how we interact with people from different parts of India, or overseas for that matter, and what influences us. And Hinduism has thrived because we have absorbed all these wonderful influences from all the visitors that came to India. And that is why we have, thrived. And so we have all these ancestral practices, old ancient practices, but we also know how to be progressive. And Hinduism itself allows for that. So yes, this is, Hindutva ideology is harming Hindus the most. And then, of course, like I said, the minorities. One thing I just want to also talk about is this discussion about Hindutva now trying to say that the indigenous people of India are Hindus. So they're trying to change them from Adivasi, which is the Indian word, for our indigenous peoples into Vanvasi, which is forest dweller, which is actually a completely different thing. And I came across a wonderful tweet by a well-known journalist in Maharashtra, which is my state, where he pointed out that in our mythology, the Ramayana, which is a story of Lord Ram, he is a Vanvasi, and that is a forest dweller because he was exiled by his father. Whereas Shabari, the woman who offered him the little berry that she tasted to make sure that it was sweet before she offered it to him, and he accepted that. Shabari was an Adivasi, or one of the indigenous peoples of that forest where Ram had gone. And that is the difference. And these are the differences that we as Hindus acknowledge, but Hindutva is eroding. So pretty much this is, for me, this is my response to this amazing piece of research, that I'm just really thankful that this is there, and that we can refer back to it, and then we can talk about what kind of Hindus we are. So thank you so much for having me, and I hope I made sense to you all. Talking about what Hinduism is.
I think you're muted there, Balamahan.
Thank you for letting me know. I was just saying it's wonderful to hear your reflections, and especially as a member for Hindus for Human Rights, how the political project of Hindutva lays claims to the pluralistic religions of Hinduism and the impacts that it has on you personally and also more broadly. So I'd like now to ask whether Dr. Joseph Thomas from Aotearoa Alliance Progressive Indians would like to offer your reflections.
Absolutely. Kia ora, everyone. Thanks a lot, Mohan, and Richa, for presenting this paper. I think it's very valuable. The fact that we are able to see all the different strands of the various Hindutva groups in New Zealand being listed out and collated in an article, I think it's really good. Bit of context, I represent Aotearoa Alliance of Progressive Indians. We have been trying to raise awareness about the human rights violations happening in India since 2019 in New Zealand. Like we have this far-right Hindu nationalist government in India, which has been targeting Indian citizens, like religious minorities, ethnic minorities, linguistic minorities, journalists, students, climate activists, indigenous groups, basically anyone who does not agree with them have been targeted. So we have been trying to raise awareness in New Zealand. So I'll quickly talk about 3 points, which I think is really relevant. So the first point is this is like a request to the mainstream media here, as well as to the politicians. I mean, what I see is the total disregard of the mainstream press and many politicians when they engage with groups such as the Hindu Council New Zealand, which proudly claims that they are VHP's chapter of New Zealand. The thing is like this, like when they engage with groups such as VHP New Zealand, there are direct consequences back in India. So what sort of happens is that we have the politicians presiding over VHP's events here, and the media giving space for VHP New Zealand. And once these events are finished, the pictures and the video content goes back to India. And back in India, it's celebrated as if, here we go, New Zealand politicians are presiding over VHP's events. So it's the activities which we do, which is what? Lynching people, raping women. It's completely fine because New Zealand politicians are legitimizing it. It's the same with the media. Like when the media, I think the latest one is like 2 weeks ago, July 31st from by RNZ. Like when they reach out and contact and speak to these far right groups which identify themselves as chapters of violent terrorist organizations like VHP, they are actually legitimizing these violence, legitimizing the violence. Like our family and our loved ones back in India are already being terrorized, right? And we come to New Zealand and we see the same organizations getting space in the mainstream media. And that's just not good. That's terrible. The next point would be the other consequence, I would say, is like there are all these social media platforms, hate ecosystems, I would say, where there is like, if you monitor the content and the chatter, it's extremely Islamophobic, homophobic, and also, I mean, they kind of do all kinds of stuff, including targeting activists, doxing people, anyone who doesn't agree to their. So you see all that. One simple example is like, and I would say it's the tip of the iceberg. Like in Facebook, there are groups like Hindus in New Zealand, and there is another one called Proud Indian Nationalists. So when we monitor their content, we can see the content is extremely Islamophobic. And the minute you start, and the minute when the media and the politicians legitimize chapters of VHP, it's these hate groups which feel empowered, and they do their hate mongering more. And that brings to the last point, the fact that we have seen incidents of violence in different countries by Hindutva ideologues, including UK. We have seen people getting death threats in, like progressive Hindus, like especially from Hindus for Human Rights. When they speak against the violence of VHP, they kind of get death threats and stuff. And so we have seen such incidents happening outside India in various countries. And if we are trying to legitimize VHP and its chapters in New Zealand, we'll also begin to see such events happening in New Zealand. We might. And there is no reason to do this. The media should stop engaging with like VHP's New Zealand chapters without question, and also stop giving space, stop engaging, stop presiding over their meetings and stuff. I mean, it's just not good. So I think with that, I would just wind up my corridor. But thanks a lot for inviting me. It's such an honor to be here, and it's such wonderful work. It's really inspiring and empowering that you are all doing this. So with that, thanks a lot. I'll wind up.
Kia ora, Joseph. Thank you so much, especially for talking to the bidirectional flow of the Hindutva movement as it is a transnational network. I think the way that you've articulated that is really powerful with the evidence from what you've noticed in the groups, online digital groups. Byron, could we invite you to say a few words in response to the paper and what you've been observing as an author of a recently published book called Fear?
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who has put together this paper and who's come along to this presentation tonight. It's all really important and really valuable research that's being done. I think that one of the reasons it's so important and so valuable is that I think there's a real ignorance among Pākehā New Zealanders and perhaps other ethnic groups here as well as to the nature of Hindutva, and even an understanding really of what's going on in India, despite the fact that it is really a world power, the world's largest democracy and now the world's largest population by country, world's largest country by population as well. I think there's still an ignorance that exists here, and these groups, some of which have been talked about tonight, are seen by a lot of our politicians as cultural groups or groups representing the entirety of the Indian or even the entirety of the South Asian community in Aotearoa, when, as we've seen today, many of them are aligned to a particular political ideology and are promoting that. And so we get things like, as Joseph was talking about, politicians going along to their events and then having those photographs published in the Observer in India. And I think many of these politicians are not aware that they're lending their mana and lending their image to this type of ideology and these types of organizations. So I think the work being done to educate people and raise awareness of Hindutva and of these Hindutva linked organizations in this country is really, really important. I think even for generally progressive and anti-colonial Pākehā and probably some other people here, there's a bit of an ignorance there. I'm by training a historian. I studied India a little bit when I did my degree, but because I was studying the British Empire, and I think even if you're studying and coming at it from an anti-colonial, decolonial perspective, if you're coming at it from that Western lens, you're not going to see all of the nuances of what exists in in Indian society. When I was researching for my book and for the chapter on Hindutva that I've included, I said to a friend of mine who had studied sociology that I was reading about Hindu nationalism, and she said, "Oh, like anti-colonialism and Mahatma Gandhi and so forth." And I said, "Well, I'm reading about the people who murdered Mahatma Gandhi. It's more complex than how people see it." So this work is really important, and I'm glad that events like this are happening, and I hope that this can get out to more people. Another thing I thought I'd mention was Mahesh Bindra, who I think Mohan mentioned. He may even be returned as a member of Parliament following the election, looking at some of the recent polls, and depending on where he is on the New Zealand First list. One of the things I was surprised to find when researching my book was that he had travelled to India for the 50th anniversary of the VHP, and the only media that covered that here was the Indian Weekender, who published a photo of him with VHP international leader Praveen Togadia. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing that name there. And this is somebody who is from Gujarat, and after the pogroms that took place there in 2002, welcomed the description of the state as a Hindutva laboratory, and said that experiment of the Hindutva lab will be repeated in Delhi. And I feel like if we had a politician, a sitting member of parliament, going to Europe and meeting with far-right groups, there'd be more awareness of that and more coverage in the media of that. And I think perhaps because Indian Weekender is seen as an Indian publication, not specifically a Indian publication that takes a specific political line, perhaps this isn't being covered the way that something like that really should be. So I look forward to growing awareness of Hindutva in Aotearoa and of these Hindutva linked organisations and individuals. So thank you again to everyone who has contributed to this paper and who has spoken at this meeting tonight.
Kia ora, Byron. Thank you so much. I just want to draw our attention to something so powerful that you said, which is that when you were speaking with sociology scholars and talking a little bit about what you were researching, the way to understand it is a political ideology that motivated the assassination of Gandhi. That's the background context in which the legacy of the Hindutva ideology continues. And that's awareness building. The work that you do is so important. So thank you so much for your kōrero. I want to invite Professor Mohan, if you want to respond perhaps or note some of the amazing questions and conversations that are coming through the chat, and the engagement that we have seen from our listeners. Thank you so much. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. I will turn now to Professor Mohan and let you respond to any of the comments that you're noticing.
Kia ora, Bala Mohan. Thank you so much. I just want to first acknowledge Sapna, Joseph, Byron for your beautiful and powerful responses. I think the three of you highlight to me really three important points. One is the distinctiveness of Hindutva as a political project that is markedly different from Hinduism as a religion. That concept, I think, is really critical, and that connects to, Byron, your ideas of public pedagogy. One of the things is, understandably so, for a lot of the mainstream Aotearoa, it's difficult to interrogate or speak about Hindutva because there is that conflation of Hindutva and Hinduism. And to the extent that that is understood clearly, I think that's a really important part of engaging in anti-racist conversations. Joseph, I loved the connection that you made with the digital infrastructure and the digital architecture. That is really important. And as we have seen in places like Leicester, it is that interplay between the digital and diaspora Hindutva organizations that is often mobilized within the context of communal clashes and violence that we then see play out. And Byron, thank you for doing that amazing work of building that pedagogy and those connections, and actually seeing, as you have done in your book, the linkages between Hindutva organizations within the broader context of other hate organizations, connecting it to white supremacy. I think those kinds of linkages are really critical. And then the point that you raised about Mahesh Bindra and how important it is in terms of pedagogy and electoral politics, I find that to be a powerful question. Perhaps I can invite you, Balamohan or Breeze, to pick up some of the key questions that have been raised, and we can invite the whole panel to respond depending upon who wants to respond. I'm going to just start us off by asking one question that is by Aunt Selina, coming from a Tangata Whenua perspective. Aunt Selina is a researcher at CARE, and she asks, here they go again, the colonizers thinking they know what's best for us, our indigenous Tangata Mana Whenua. So can we look at Hindutva itself as a colonizing project, and how does that connect with the question of indigeneity? Anyone?
Can I answer that partly? I think I sort of mentioned this when I was talking about Hinduism, and how the Hindutva project is appropriating indigeneity in India as part of Hinduism, whereas that is not correct. The multiple indigenous peoples of India have had their own civilizations and ways of life that belong to them, and we all interact with each other. And historically, there have been tensions, yes, when you sort of, over a period of time, and it was started by the British colonizers, as we know, who tried to label a lot of the indigenous peoples as, under criminal titles, but that was all taken away, and indigenous peoples were given the respect that they needed. That was their respect once we became independent. However, that is being erased by Hindutva, which ironically is interesting, because over here, when they're interacting with Tangata Whenua, Mana Whenua, they call themselves indigenous. Guna Magesan, and I think there is a documented evidence where he's called himself indigenous of a specific part of the state of Karnataka, which is how he has created relationships with Tangata Whenua of Aotearoa. Again, that is, but that's because there's not enough information about the caste system, about Brahmanism out here in Aotearoa, and therefore any Brahmin can call themselves indigenous while at the same time destroying people's lives back there. Yeah. Does that answer the question partly?
Sapna, yes, it does. I just wanted to add one thing, regarding Mr. Dr. Magesan, is that I'm not quite sure if, he has claims to Adivasi identity in particular ways within that region or not. But I think, the broader comment that you're making, that really still holds, which is when you're packaging Hindutva as representing indigeneity, that it does so through the co-option of indigeneity and simultaneously through the erasure of indigeneity. I think that's a brilliant point.
That's correct. And we should really be aware of that in terms of even now with the forest, the act that was passed to protect forests, what is actually a way of taking away land from indigenous people because it's undocumented land. Again, this is a historical thing, as we know. It's undocumented land that is being taken by the Hindutva project. And what is happening to our Kuki women sisters in Manipur who are indigenous to Manipur and to Mizoram is because, those, indigenous people's lives don't carry any value. While at the same time, in context to Aotearoa, it's become a way of saying, oh, we were colonized, you have been colonized, we are indigenous, you are indigenous, let's get together. It's very problematic. Yeah.
Yes. And connected to that, Sapna, is sort of the far right ideology of Hindutva, if you will, particularly in terms of its framing of development projects, have directly targeted indigenous lands and spaces of life and livelihood, including forests. Of course, that is not just particular to Hindutva. It is an extension of the policies, the neoliberal policies that were carried out by the Congress government before that. And the other point I also wanted to make is sort of the linkage of Hindutva with the Adani Corporation and the Adani Group, which is a multinational extractive corporation and is a key funder of Hindutva. And then you think about Adani mining in Australia directly threatening the livelihoods of indigenous communities in Australia. So that kind of positioning of Hindutva as indigeneity is both co-optive, but it also becomes an infrastructure for violence, as you say so brilliantly.
There's just one more very small point I want to add with regards to Fenua land, that there are Hindutva people who are developing, have bought tracts of land and developing land, again with complete disregard to the fact that it's stolen land, isn't it? We can't really just go in there and expect it to appreciate because we have bought it, which is again the neoliberal sort of colonization that is coming from Hindutva. Yeah, that's all. Yeah.
And I just wanted to read, Sapna, what Anselina then responded to you and saying that, Kia ora, Sapna, they are not indigenous to Aotearoa, of course. You cannot erase that. We are Tauiwi, any of us, irrespective of whatever claims to indigeneity we might make to particular context that we come from. And then she says, until they can speak Maori and acknowledge our culture, they still remain colonizers in Aotearoa, New Zealand. What a brilliant point, Anselina. Kia ora. Lovely. Shall we move on to the next questions? Balamohan, did you want to pick a question?
Let's have a look at a question that's come from Anahira Rostenberg. Apologies if I've mispronounced your last name. The question here is, how does uncritical multiculturalism support Hindutva in Aotearoa, New Zealand? And I invite perhaps Richa, if you'd like to respond to this.
Yes, of course. This is something that was elaborated more on in the paper, but we do have this idea of uncritical multiculturalism, particularly in Western nations. This idea of multiculturalism for the sake of multiculturalism, without looking deeper into it. Through this system, you often see groups like the Hindu Council, like the HSS, present themselves more as, I suppose, ethnic lobbies and representative of the whole of the Hindu community. They try to speak for the whole group and kind of homogenize that. Because within the Western conception of multiculturalism, having everyone within kind of neat little boxes, like, oh, these are the Hindus, they have these beliefs, this and all that, is kind of suits the system a lot better. And actually, I might pull up a quote from the paper. Give me a second.
You mute.
Oh, I don't know how that happened. Was I muted the whole time, or?
No.
Oh, okay. So yeah, this is a quote from Balmurli Natarajan in his essay "Practicing Hindus, Hindutva and Multiculturalism." A majority religion in India, Hinduism has traveled across national borders to become a minority religion in other social spaces, such as the USA and the UK. In such societies, Hinduism has increasingly come under the dominance of Hindutva's majoritarian ideology, which is successfully represented under multiculturalism as a benign ideology contributing to cultural diversity. Consequently, representations of religions in school textbooks, scholarly writings, and popular media have become key sites for the enactment of multiculturalism's tolerance, with each religion's community taking upon itself the leadership and rights of representing its own authenticity on a multicultural canvas. Yeah, I hope that answered your question. And if anyone else has anything more to add to that, happy to hear it.
I think one point to note here is that the number of our listeners who have been tuning in have noted actually the pluralistic character that they find in the communities. And the quote that you just read out, the important bit to highlight here is that over especially the recent few decades, Hinduism has increasingly come under the dominance of Hindutva's ideology. So the narrative that you offered, Sapna, and the quote that you read from the scholar Balmurli Natarajan points to the strategy of equivocation, the communicative strategy of equivocation that is outlined in the paper. I want to turn now to a question that's come from Jasmine Taylor. I think this is an interesting and important question that perhaps extends exactly this question, which is, I'm curious about how to inform general community and disabled communities about Hindutva and how to differentiate between that and Hinduism. Because one example, for community organizations working on creating safer space policies and not wanting to align with anything fascist, yet to be inclusive. I think this is an important question to grapple with, and it would be great to have any of your insights.
I can speak a little bit to this. Yeah, it can be quite difficult work, especially without that more solid connection to the community. Yeah, I suppose in working in a few of the organizations I've worked with, both with rainbow communities as well as a few other communities through my work, one thing that I've really noticed is there wasn't enough information out there to really understand, unless you have this background, who the Hindutva organizations are. They were never really compiled in an easy to find place, which is part of what this paper hopes to do. It hopes to really make those links clear and be able to kind of authoritatively say that, these are Hindutva linked organizations in Aotearoa, and they have to be treated that way. So I think that was a key role, a key purpose, of this research.
One of the themes that we come back to in our work using the culture-centered approach is foregrounding the voices of the margins and the people in the communities who are most affected by the project. So that means in our instances, the idea of India and Indianness ought not to be equated and ought not to be allowed to be colonized by the Hindutva ideology. And what that means is to note actually the diversity of Indian voices in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So one way perhaps to also tackle this question is to know, well, what voices are being silenced with the sort of, with the stage presence, so to speak, of Hindutva. And that means listening to diverse communities, gender diverse communities, Muslims and Christian Indian communities, and our rationalists as well. The rationalists who make a lot of the journalists in the Indian context who are under threat and muzzled by the Indian Hindutva ecosystem. So one of the key themes of the CCA is what voices are not able to be present due to the dominance of the political ideology. I want now to turn to a question by Muhammad Harun, and this I'll ask just to be brought up on the screen here so we can read it. So the question asked, I have a question about Hinduphobia. We very often see Hindutva organizations using Hinduphobia to label and promote hatred against mainstream Hindus, minorities. For example, in Australia, one Hindu couple was subject to beheading threats after being labeled Hinduphobic. This was reported in Amos. So the question, 1, do we recognize Hinduphobia as a mechanism of spreading hate against mainstream Hindus and other minorities? Based on this, my question number 2, can New Zealand religious vilification laws? Sorry, that question cuts off there, but let's tackle the first one first.
Yeah, Mohan
Go ahead,
wants
Professor
to.
Mohan.
Yeah, that's such a brilliant question, Harun. As we have shared in the earlier work of CARE, the strategy of Hinduphobia is what we call a communicative inversion, or turning materiality on its head by constructing an image. So let's get a couple of points really clear here. One is empirically, Hinduism is a majority religion in India, and Christians are minorities. Within that context, then Hindutva is mobilized to disenfranchise minorities, both in terms of the uses of violence, including material forms of violence, brick and mortar violence, as well as in the form of policy infrastructures. But to do this is why it's a communicative inversion. It manufactures the narrative of Hinduphobia, or Hindu khatre mein hai, the Hindu is in danger. And you turn this into sort of the classic fascist strategy, if you will. You see this in sort of Nazi propaganda as well. So they're producing the white community as being in a threat by Jews within the context of Germany, by migrants and Muslim migrants, particularly within the context of contemporary Europe. That then becomes the mobilizing feature of hate. So in that sense, Hinduphobia is able to be mobilized across the diaspora by appealing to that idea of sort of superficial multiculturalism, where sort of the claim can be made that any critique of Hindutva is an attack on the Hindu, and it's a direct threat to Hindus. And as you rightly point out, Harun, often Hindutva ideologues target Hindus as part of their campaigns in sort of generating and constructing Hinduphobia. So, when Sapna and I have been targeted, or when Richa and Balamohan have been targeted, we are all practicing Hindus in different ways. Similarly, with the Dismantling Global Hindutva conference that brought together academics across the globe to critique the violence of Hindutva and the ways in which it poses a threat to sort of the plural fabrics across democracies. Academics there were targeted, and often the academics that were targeted identified as practicing Hindus. So, it's really important that we continue to highlight this. And you bring up the case of the restaurant owners in Australia being targeted. So how Hindutva mobilizes Hinduphobia to target Hindus. But also then, your point about religious vilification laws. So it's a form of religious vilification because, as you rightly point out, Hinduphobia is a hate construct, ironically, right? And that's why it's a communicative inversion. It is used in order to perpetuate hate. I mean, we have experienced, a number of us here in this room, directed attacks, including death threats and rape threats, emergent out of this construct of Hinduphobia. And ironically, in Australia, New Zealand context, much of this has been mobilized by a white Australian who identifies as a yogini and has become a key architect of Hindutva in this part of the world. So, what do you bring up in terms of the religious vilification laws? I think it's really critical for us to look at what kind of policy infrastructure we have, and what kind of legal infrastructure we have access to in order to establish Hinduphobia as a hate construct that is being used to perpetuate hate and to target. Thank you, Harun.
You're mute.
Apologies. Thank you so much, Professor Mohan. I noticed that Byron has just dropped out, but there's a question here from Magnus Pechan, and it would be interesting to bring this up on the screen, partly because we can speak a little bit to the work that Byron does. I'll read this question first. Did the research also investigate links between Hindutva organizations in Aotearoa and other hate organizations? The answer to our research is no. Our research has not covered that scope. But what I would like to share is Byron's work investigating the fake news network in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and particularly the kinds of news media platforms operating in New Zealand with the claim to represent Hindu and Indian interests, networking with Steve Bannon's New Zealand News Division. So a little bit of this is covered in articles published on the Webworm with David Farrier. There are 2 articles that Byron looks at and identifies Hindutva representatives on those channels. And also, it's a good point here to speak a little bit about his book, Fear. So these are 2 recommendations that we might look to understand a little bit further this network that you're drawing our attention to.
Can I add to that, if that's okay? Just a very small addendum. Yeah, that's Byron's book, which is pretty amazing. Yeah. I just wanted to add to this, Magnus, to answer your question about links. We don't know as yet of any formal links, but they just creep up informally from time to time. For example, when the film The Kashmir Files was being released in Aotearoa, and Indian Muslim organizations, along with Aotearoa Alliance of Progressive Indians and quite a few other affiliated organizations, wrote to the chief censor to review the film, the classification of the film, and perhaps try and put a warning, content warning at the beginning of the film. A global, there was a, what would the word be, Mohan? It was a global, global sort of uproar. Yes, uproar against, created by the film's director himself. There was a global uproar against these organizations that had written to the chief censor. But what happened was that these Hindutva groups mobilized politicians in New Zealand, in Aotearoa. So David Seymour, Melissa Lee, Winston Peters, and the Free Speech Union, which we would classify, I suppose, as a supremacist organization. Again, not formally. Again, this is just anecdotally, is they all jumped in to attack the chief censor, and they all jumped in to even disseminate the message of these Hindutva groups who were, abusing the chief censor and trolling Indian Muslim groups over here, people over here. So that is one informal sort of, example, but we haven't looked at. I don't think this research looks at that, but I hope that answers your question. There's many informal links.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your responses. A question that we might like to look at next is by Deepak Ji. There's one question in our chat that's just being brought up now. Here it is. We saw how Australia's One Nation Party, known for its Islamophobic and anti-immigrant policies, rallied behind VHP Australia when questions were asked in the New South Wales Parliament about their role in providing religious education in New South Wales, despite being classified as an extremist organisation by CIA. I think this is to speak a little bit to the conversation that we were having just before about Magnus Pechan's question. Byron, are there any further reflections that you want to answer? Our discussion was mainly around whether there might be thoughts that you'd like to offer about the interplay between different organizations, white supremacist on the one hand, and we know historically that Hindutva as a political ideology has scaffolded itself around the white supremacist ideology from the 20th century organizing, but contemporary empirical research that you're undertaking, any reflections that you want to offer?
Mm. Well, one of the really interesting things I found learning more about Hindutva and the way that Muslims are talked about within this ideology has a lot of parallels with the ideologies of the European far right. So in the European far right, they'll construct this whole historiography around an Ottoman invasion of Europe, and we see this in like the Christchurch shooters manifesto, where he referred to all Muslims as Turks throughout his manifesto, and how he adorned his weapons with the names of people who had led battles against Ottoman invaders in Vienna and France and other places, and how similar that was to the way the Mughal invasion spoken about in a kind of Hindutva historiography. And we had these two, one in Europe, one in India, talking as if there was this Muslim civilization that was historically had invaded, and trying to link that to the political present with the presence of Muslims in India or the presence of Muslims in Europe. So I think there's a real possibility of some of those links being developed between the European far right and the Hindutva far right, particularly among those on the European far right who are a bit of a fringe, but people have been influenced by like the Italian fascist thinker Julius Evola, who wanted to harken back to traditional Europe, so traditional that it was pre-Christianity, and links it into almost sort of Indo-European mythology and things. And I have seen people in that sort of space who are trying to construct this historiography of like Indo-European civilization, having a lot of sympathy for Hindutva, which they see as a closer connection to that pre-Christian European society than what exists now. So there's a number of different parallels there, and some of them are very fringe. Like I think those Julius Evola followers are very fringe, even within the European far right, which is much more commonly into sort of Christian nationalism than into this sort of Indo-European civilization. But there are definitely areas there to observe and to study further.
Kia ora. I just wanted to build a little bit on Byron's articulation. So, Byron, it's great that you talked about Julius Evola. And, one of the things is the publishing house that publishes much of the Evola for the European far-right Arctos Media, for a point of time was located and operating out of India. And it publishes both far-right texts as well as the Hindutva texts. That intersection is really interesting. But also, one of the key Hindutva figures, Savitri Devi, who was an inspiration for the Nazis, if you will, is reinvigorated right in the sort of European far right networks. With the recent riots that we witnessed in Leicester, one of the things that our research observed there is the ways in which Op India, which is a far right hate platform coming out of India, and Nupur J. Sharma, the editor of Op India, there was interfacing in terms of that Islamophobic hate with Tommy Robinson, who is a far-right figure within that European context. And in fact, she was going to hold an interview with Robinson about how, this Muslim invasion within, and how Muslims are changing the demographics and civilization of Britain. And then she held back, and that discourse I was mapping, including the discourse with Sarah L. Gates, it was very interesting to map, because here Gates was saying that if you were to go to interview him, we would be under so much scrutiny. So please don't do that. That will get us into trouble, sort of thing. But I think that linkage with Islamophobia is really critical to examine. And the one last point I want to make, and this connects to the Christchurch terror attack, is that, when I was mapping the discursive infrastructure and responses to both the Christchurch terror attack and then the Lynn Mall attack, the key thing to sort of articulate within that sense was most of the Islamophobic hate that was coming after the Christchurch terror attack, celebrating the attack, was coming from Hindutva accounts, explicitly out of India and in the diaspora. Similarly, post the Lynn Mall attack, what we found is over 70% of the hate, particularly, the hate that was saying that, of course, this will happen in New Zealand because it has become a Muslim country, and then would take images of the prime minister wearing the hijab and say that, this prime minister has become a hijabi. That kind of disinformation-based hate discourse was coming out of the Hindutva networks. And some of that, played out, going back to Joseph's point, in groups such as Hindus for, the Hindus in New Zealand group that operates out of Facebook. So clearly a lot of convergence between Hindutva and white supremacy, at least in terms of the discursive infrastructure that we see online. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you so much, everybody, for the time that you've given. Byron, to hear about your reflections. Sapna, for representing the voice for Hindus for Human Rights. And Joseph, for Aotearoa Alliance of Progressive Indians. From myself, from Professor Mohan, and from Richa, really appreciate your correspondence. And also, of course, to all of the folks who have engaged so beautifully on our chat streams on Facebook, on YouTube. The conversations have been amazing, and we've learned a lot from just reading your reflections. And in closing, what I thought I might do is offer a little bit which might add to the kind of response to what we ought to do in terms of India and Indianness, and the way that Hindutva organizations, in claiming to represent the disenfranchised Hindu, the historically victimized Hindu, risk erasing over. So I'd like to end with a karakia, an ideal by Sant Kabir, a short verse which exemplifies really, for me, the syncretic culture that is to be found in India. So the karakia goes like this. Koi kahe, koi jape Rahim Rahim, koi jape hai Ram. Das Kabir hai Prem Pujari, donon ko pranam. Thank you so much for joining us today. And
thank you, everyone.
We look forward to next conversations.
Thank you.